Over the last 50 years, Western nations have poured over $1.2 trillion of aid money into Africa. That is more capital than the entire gross domestic product of Spain, Australia, or South Korea. This chart plots that influx of cash against the continent's poverty rate. When the modern aid experiment began, just 11% of the continent lived in poverty. By the 1990s, following decades of global financial campaigns, that number spiked to 66%. Today, it rests at 38%, over 3 times higher than when the money started flowing. Scaling out the data reveals a widening global disparity. In the 1950s, the average Western European was 5 times richer than the average African. Today, after a half-century of continuous financial intervention, that wealth gap has more than doubled to 13 times. For decades, Western policymakers operated on the assumption that extreme poverty is strictly a symptom of missing capital. This logic suggests a simple solution: fill the region's resource gap with enough cash, and the economy will follow. While the public associates aid with the construction of schools, roads, and hospitals, a growing body of research indicates that the continuous influx of money creates structural headwinds that prevent the very growth it aims to spark. By treating extreme poverty as a math equation to be solved with capital, decades of Western financial involvement have inadvertently sustained the very conditions they intended to erase. To understand why the world was confident that giving money would work, we must look at the historical control group. After World War II, Europe was physically and economically decimated. Entire power grids, transportation networks, and industrial centers were reduced to rubble. This created a massive geopolitical threat for the United States. Across Western Europe, communist parties were gaining traction. American policymakers realized that an economically desperate Europe was likely to either vote in communist governments or fall victim to a Soviet invasion. In 1947, the US government launched the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, America shipped over $13 billion, roughly $160 billion in today's money, directly into Europe to kickstart immediate economic investment. The plan was a rapid success. In a single decade, GDP per capita across the region grew by almost 35%. This proved to American policymakers that massive capital injection could build wealthy, reliable international allies in a very short timeframe. In the 1960s, the United States shifted its focus toward post-colonial Africa, hoping to repeat the Marshall Plan's success on a new continent. The continent lacked paved roads, electricity, and functioning government bureaucracies, but it possessed massive oil reserves, abundant copper fields, and rare minerals. It was viewed as a future economic giant, needing only seed funding. This chart shows aid aggressively scaling, from $500 million in the 60s to a $20 billion peak in the 90s, eclipsing 60. This era cemented a simplified narrative in the public consciousness. It encouraged the Western public to view African poverty as a tragic shortage of funds, effectively ignoring the roles of local politics, structural corruption, and bad governance. Today, aid flows have reached record highs of over $50 billion a year, yet 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 a day, the highest absolute number of people in extreme poverty in history. The emotional desire for a simple fix overrode the need to address the complex systemic causes of the continent's economic stagnation. To explain this failure, development experts point to a variable called institutions. These are the underlying frameworks of a society, the legal systems, property rights, and bureaucracies that govern a nation. When the Marshall Plan injected cash into Europe, it utilized states that still possessed functional ministries capable of distributing resources. Africa, however, was filled with merely independent states, inheriting frameworks left behind by colonial rulers. Economists classify these as extractive institutions. These governments were engineered from the ground up for the specific purpose of pulling wealth away from the general population to serve a small ruling elite. In an extractive environment, billions of dollars of unearned cash bypass the citizens entirely. Funds intended for public infrastructure are quickly absorbed by the ruling class, funding private jets and luxury goods, while 30% of the population lives without clean water. In an environment lacking functional legal frameworks, Large-scale aid provides resources for the ruling class to maintain their grip on power without ever improving the lives of the population. This flowchart illustrates a healthy state. A government collects taxes from citizens, and in exchange, citizens demand infrastructure, creating a loop of accountability. Foreign aid severs this relationship. By receiving its budget from foreign donors, the government no longer relies on its people to survive. This creates a political reality where rulers are financially independent from the working class. Leaders do not need to build schools or paved roads to stimulate the economy because their wealth comes from overseas wire transfers. They are effectively insulated from the demands of their own people. The decision to treat extreme poverty as a simple capital deficiency has inadvertently funded the structures that prevent Africa's political and economic evolution. Throughout the 2000s, foreign aid poured into Malawi, eventually making up more than 40% of the country's national budget. Government officials were caught stealing huge sums of that money, siphoning off millions to pay for luxury cars, private homes, and international shopping trips. You might expect a scandal involving public funds to spark mass outrage, but there was basically no political fallout. The apathy makes sense when you look at how the government was funded. Because the money came from foreign sources rather than domestic taxes, Malawian citizens had very little leverage to demand systemic change. Usually, a country achieves long-term economic development from the ground up. Small businesses, farmers, and local entrepreneurs create jobs and expand access to goods. But injecting massive amounts of foreign aid into a country actively suffocates this development. By funding governments externally, foreign aid severs the critical financial feedback loop between a state and its people. The government becomes accountable to its foreign donors and can afford to ignore its own citizens. You can see how this suffocates domestic progress by looking at the textile industry. By the early 2000s, nearly 80% of clothing sold in some African nations consisted of cheap apparel imported from the West. On the surface, this looks like a win-win. Western nations reduce their clothing waste, and local populations get access to inexpensive clothes. But the effect on local manufacturing is devastating. In Ghana alone, over 80% of domestic textile factories shut down between 1990 and 2010. This chart shows the continent-wide impact. As factories close, the knowledge, machinery, and networks needed to sustain a homegrown industry disappear. Over the last 2 decades, Africa's total industrial sector has shrunk from 15% of the continent's economy to just 10%. Injecting huge quantities of free goods into a developing economy short-circuits local progress. It places aid organizations in direct, unbeatable competition with domestic businesses. Beyond the collapse of shops, aid money triggers a macroeconomic shift, distorting the entire national economy. To see how, we look at the export-led model, the proven formula used by almost every rapidly developing nation to generate wealth. Nations like South Korea and Taiwan generated immense wealth by building up domestic industries, manufacturing low-cost goods, and selling them to Western consumers on the international market. This diagram illustrates an often overlooked mechanism required for this model to work: a weak domestic currency. Intentionally maintaining a low currency value makes a country's exports cheaper on the global market, which boosts demand from foreign buyers. Foreign aid reverses this process. When billions of dollars in aid arrive, those funds must be aggressively converted into the local currency so that governments and organizations can actually spend the money on the ground. Because so much foreign capital is trying to buy the local currency all at once, the massive surge in demand artificially drives the price of the local currency upward on foreign exchange markets. A highly valued currency means that for foreigners trying to buy a country's produce, everything suddenly costs more. The buyers stop buying. As a result, exports in Africa today account for only about 20% of average GDP, less than half the rate of successful East Asian economies. The literal financial mechanics of injecting aid money create a systemic barrier that blocks the very path to wealth used by the world's fastest-growing nations. Compounding this macroeconomic trap is the high failure rate of aid projects. A 2012 report found that up to 70%, because the end users aren't the ones paying, they cannot withhold donor funding when a project fails. Without that critical financial feedback loop, the entire system possesses zero incentive to reward success or punish failure. None of this means that foreign aid has no role to play. In moments of immediate crisis, like famines or natural disasters, short-term emergency aid remains an absolutely vital tool for saving lives. But there is a sharp difference between emergency relief and long-term development strategy. Decades of evidence show that prolonged foreign aid only entrenches dependency. Genuine economic growth requires a pivot. The international community has to abandon the charity model and actively treat developing nations as competitive emerging markets. Sustainable economic transformation occurs when the focus shifts toward building robust local industries. And it happens when governments are finally forced to rely on and answer to their own citizens rather than foreign benefactors.